Hello and welcome to this episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social and governance. I'm your host, Andie Wood, and today we're discussing the concept of a circular economy. A circular economy encourages markets to reuse products rather than throw them out. Circularity can be seen as one approach to tackling the transition towards a sustainable future. A new book, The Circular Business Revolution, a practical framework for sustainable business models, provides a comprehensive guide for business leaders to shift from the traditional linear model to a circular profitable paradigm. Joining us on the podcast today are the co-authors Julia Binder and Manuel Braun. Julia is a professor of sustainable innovation and business transformation at the IMD Business School in Switzerland. Manuel Braun is a director at Systemiq, a global think and do tank focused on sustainability and the circular economy. He also lectures at the Technical University of Munich. Julia and Manuel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Andie.
Hello, good afternoon.
So obviously the first thing we're going to do is lay out the foundation a bit for our audience. Your book, The Circular Business Revolution, nice title there, encourages business to transition from a kind of a take, make, waste approach to one that is maybe more sustainable and circular. So as a question for both of you, how do you define that circular business model? What is your number one argument then for why a company should adopt a circular business model?
Thank you so much, Andie. I think that's a very good question. Let's start off where we were coming from when we were writing this book, was this realization that's actually not just one argument, right? There's not just this one factor that now pushes us to move beyond take, make, waste. The reason why we think we need an entirely new way of organizing our economy is basically a number of factors. So on the one hand, there is the environmental lens. We're simply not having sufficient resources to continue producing and consuming as we did in the past. We used to produce and consume as there's no tomorrow, and we know that there's a tomorrow, and we need to actually rethink our way of organizing. So there's clearly these planetary boundaries, so we rely on this framework where we say it goes beyond the climate change discussion that we currently have and that dominates in a lot of the corporate world. We think that there's actually the natural world that we need to take into consideration, and there are limited resources there. So resource scarcity is certainly one argument. There are also supply chain disruptions. So if you look at it from a purely business leader's lens, there are a lot of disruptions lately, whether this is COVID, whether these are geopolitical tensions, whether this is a war in Ukraine and other parts of the world. Business leaders need to reduce the dependencies on some of their resources. So the circular economy could be a very important way to get us there. And then, quite frankly speaking, your most important stakeholders actually demand a change from you. And this is, on the one hand, we see investors. Yes, there is some massive backlash against ESG at the moment, but nevertheless, around the globe, investors realize that sustainability issues can pose a fundamental financial risk for their investments as well. So they demand companies to do better. Consumers actually demand sustainable alternatives and back it up with their wallets for the first time. Employees want to work for a company that actually is contributing to the world in a positive sense instead of making the world a not so good place. And I think all of these factors really show. And then we have the technological transition where basically we now have access to technology that allows us to produce and consume differently. All of these factors from our perspective really push companies towards a new way of organizing. And I'll let Manuel maybe follow up with some of the perspectives inside the firm as well.
Yeah, and I think it's quite important to define what a circular economy actually is. One way how to look at this is to say that's a new paradigm of how we optimize our economy. One that is first, works without waste, so zero waste, eliminating waste. Second, it optimizes resource productivity, so we create more value from the resources that we actually use to build products, and we optimize that in the system, keep that in the system, recirculate the resources. And then third, we define an economic system that regenerates nature, that is not, doesn't have negative externalities, but positive externalities, positive effects on nature. So eliminating waste, circulating resources, and regenerating nature. That's kind of the definition of the circular economy. And the circular business model is an answer to that from a company perspective. So it's a business model by which you contribute in a positive way to nature, but at the same time, find a new way of creating economic value and a business benefit and potentially a new growth horizon for the company. So it's kind of from an inside-out perspective, a new business model of how you win in the circular economy. In the book, we go quite deep into that. Obviously, that's what the book is all about. Just very quickly, we structure that ecosystem of circular business models into different business model archetypes and patterns. So you will find 5 different business model archetypes and a world of 15 different patterns, each delivering a distinct way of kind of reinventing your business model to succeed in the circular economy.
It sounds like it's actually quite a complicated enterprise. You sort of imagine it as this very neat little circle, but you've got a lot of factors listed in there. So perhaps since your book is emphasizing the importance of these business models for future resilience, are there some examples that you can share of companies or industries that have already successfully implemented some of these models and maybe some of the impact that they're having?
Yeah. So when you look at this ecosystem of circular business models, some of these business models are more on how you build products. So optimizing resource use is, for example, one business model pattern. So your green operations, you find a new way of, for example, using secondary and decarbonized materials, and that can enable you to build a cost benefit into your product or a differentiating factor into your product. There are a lot of examples out there. One is, for example, Philips, the healthcare company, who has a very ambitious approach of redesigning products so that they fit the circular economy, and through that build a cost benefit and more resilience into the value chain when it comes to their medical devices. So that is, I think, one example which is very prominent. Another business model archetype would be, for example, you create value from waste. Often we consider waste as something that has no value, but we see more and more that that is actually not the case. Companies find creative ways of actually creating value from recycled material. So that is really becoming a reality. And a good example for that is if you look at battery manufacturers like Northvolt, for example, they start to actually build recycling plants next to their production plants to also anticipate that they need to close the material flows in the future. And we see more and more examples where companies are able to use that as a lever to also secure their supply chain of critical ingredients, for example. Then another business model archetype, which is quite relevant, is, for example, monetizing extended product lives. So, if you look at this, many high quality companies or manufacturers of high quality products create incredibly successful products and they sell it once. Often they don't know who their customer actually is. But you can also rethink this completely. Why are you actually only selling a product once? Why not multiple times? Why are you not benefiting from the life of your product if you're, for example, building a high quality product? So there are a lot of examples which fall in that business model archetype. One which I like a lot is, for example, the furniture company USM Haller, which is producing modular, high-quality furniture that is really able to, not only to make one person happy, but also is selling very successfully on second-hand markets. And the company is thinking how to participate in that. Other good examples are, for example, the VF Corporation, like a holding of several fashion brands, and they are going strongly into the resale business, for example. So rethinking the way, and they're trying to build a model where they actually customers can trade in used fashion items. They are repairing it and reselling it again. And lastly, there is one archetype which is, for example, around servitizing products. So moving from selling products to selling services. And a popular example here would be Hilti, a very successful tooling company, which moved the model from selling tools to running tool fleets as a service. So they provide their tools in a flexible model to their customers and guarantee uptime and success. These are just a few examples and a lens on different business model archetypes that you will find in the book, basically.
Yeah, there's some really interesting variation in there and definitely some innovation on some of the older business models. It sounds really, really attractive already. However, Julia, I think we do need to ask, are there pitfalls or things that companies should consider and avoid if they're thinking about following some of these examples and adopting a circular business model?
Andie, there are so many pitfalls, right? So the question is, what should we actually do is really the question. Because if you think about it, the idea of the circular economy has been around for quite a while. For at least 20 years, this has entered also some corporate discussions, and business leaders find it intuitively appealing. And nevertheless, we see very few that actually walk the talk. Why? Because it's incredibly difficult. It requires us to fundamentally and holistically rethink basically each and every part of our business. And so there are many pitfalls, but just a couple that really stood out for us as well. On the one hand, I think is oftentimes when we talk about circularity, there is a massive focus on environmental impact and not so much about the business case. If we want to have these business models to be successful, if we want to introduce circularity in our business in a way that really lasts, we also need to have a business case for this. So this is why we really emphasize and say you always need to have an impact case and a business case. They need to go hand in hand. Oftentimes we really focus and say there's a nice environmental impact, but then it remains an initiative that you cannot scale and it will rarely have an impact beyond your direct organization. Another aspect that we also see is neglecting the human element. What do I mean with that? Oftentimes, we really focus a lot on the material and technical aspects of circularity. So is it feasible? Can we actually recycle it? Can we do it? But we're not focusing so much on who are the people behind this who need to lead it, who need to sell the product, right? So we need to completely rethink that. Also, we need to completely rethink our design. And this is where some of you may know, 80% of an environmental impact of a product is actually determined at the design stage. Yet oftentimes we really think about sustainability or circularity only at the sales stage. So we really need to feed it in much more early in our value process where we really rethink design entirely. Manuel mentioned a couple of examples. All of these require that we rethink how we design our products. If we want to reintroduce them later on, if we want to have them ready for second-hand sales and so on, we need to design completely differently. And I think maybe two more aspects that I really want to highlight. There are many more, let's say, pitfalls to avoid, but two that I think are very important. One is circularity is never a single company game, right? So even if you have the best idea for a circular business model, you will rely on internal collaboration. So how do we break down the silos internally? This is not one just part of your organization that can drive this. This requires the whole organization buy-in, but not just your own organization, the entire supply chain. And this from your suppliers up to the consumers, you need to engage them. This is really something, it's an ecosystem, and you need to orchestrate this ecosystem. And then the other bigger pitfall is to put the same time frame around circular business models than you do for your current conventional business models. What we see is that we cannot just focus on these short-term wins. We need to have a different perspective. And oftentimes, because we're talking about quite radical innovation here, we need to allow for longer timeframes until they really pay off. So particularly when we talk, for instance, about servitization that Manuel mentioned, there is almost often a clear business case here, but not in the short term. Because until this really pays off, it may require some years. And this is a big challenge for business leaders because most of the time you're incentivized for every 3 months or annual reviews, right? So allowing this kind of what we call license to innovate, allowing your team to actually explore these business models and give them some more time until they're really as successful as the current business models is something that we really need if we're serious about transitioning to a circular economy.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like there are some things to consider there. So we've got some pretty compelling reasons for a model. We do have some things to avoid. What can companies therefore do to put all of this together and actually consider putting this into practice? How do they get to a circular business model?
This is a great question. This was exactly the question that guided a lot of our thinking and why we actually wrote a book in the first place was because we sat together and Manuel was driving this agenda and his corporate activities. I was driving it more on an executive education lens. And the number one question we always came across was how, right? We don't need to convince anyone anymore about the why. I think most people are actually there, but we need to convince them and help them and support them on the how. And this is why we've really got our head around and on basis of all our consulting and teaching, we basically developed these 4-step processes to really almost like take every business leader by the hand and say, okay, what are the steps you need to go through if you really want to now successfully introduce new business models? And basically we have 4 worksheets that help and that structure our thinking here. And in the first one, we're basically touching upon what I mentioned at the beginning. Understand the signals for change. What is actually going on in your ecosystem that is pushing you to change your business as usual, right? So what are some of the signals that you're seeing? Which ones are the most pressing one? Because these will already guide you to certain business models. And the second one then is a very important one. Here we're focusing on where do you actually want to go? And this sounds like common sense, but actually what we find, it's oftentimes not, right? Oftentimes, in most companies, they're doing something on sustainability or circularity, but it's very much initiative based. And these initiatives, they will never be like a radical innovation, a radical change to what the organization is doing. So if you're really serious about moving towards a circular and regenerative future, you need to define a vision where you want to go. And here we rely on a methodology that is still not as used as you would think. It's called backcasting or future back. So it's the opposite of forecasting. Forecasting in many ways says we build on the past and present to continue thinking how the future will develop. Backcasting or future back takes the opposite approach. It says, where do you want to go? Really picture that vision. And starting from there, we walk the way back. How do we actually get there? And this helps you to think more radically about what is actually what I want to achieve? What is our ambition? Where do we want to go? And then choose the right business models that will bring us there.
The core of the book is really around exploring these different business model archetypes to some degree and these patterns. There is more than 100 examples in the book that should give inspiration about what is possible. So the worksheet 3 is really about like collecting these different ideas. We want to make it easy to pull it together and take that almost like set of different opportunities that you have and help the reader to build a pathway using that backcasting approach, basically to create a pathway from where you want to get to where you are today and how this could outplay and how the different business model patterns can work together to get you there. So that's the kind of core of the worksheet 3. And then finally, worksheet 4 is what we call the readiness scan. It's basically a survey, a tool, easy to use, which is tackling a lot of the factors that Julia has outlined just before around the different challenges or enablers, if we look at it from that way, to really build the circular business model into your practical operations. So basically, that readiness scan helps to identify some of these barriers early on and provide some guidance then on what to do. And that readiness scan is also something which we're currently putting into a digital form, which should soon be available for everybody just to use and to get a quick pulse check on what are some of these challenges and how to reach them.
That does sound very useful. Something that I've seen companies do, I think you mentioned Philips earlier as one, is also give themselves targets related to their circular ambitions. So Philips reports their proportion of their revenue that's related to the circular business model and their ability to achieve that. Is that something you also see other companies doing, is setting targets? Does that help them progress? Or is that more about demonstrating that they're progressing?
It's so important. It's so important, and I believe Philips is a really good example. And I believe they have set sales-oriented targets on circular revenues, but also design-oriented targets of like kind of transforming the product portfolio. And I think they have defined that across hierarchical levels, even on a board level. I think making that part of a compensation package, and I think that's very important because it will show that this is a priority, and it will help to align the incentive systems. We have also seen negative examples, right? Look at actually the contrary effects. We've been in conversations with organizations who wanted to, for example, build a service-based business model. Let's say move from selling a machine to moving it to an as-a-service model, charging based on the parts that a machine produces. And in that setup, the company realized that actually the sales incentive schemes were not adapted to that. So the sales force was still incentivized heavily to selling actually machines. And the new model had it very difficult because it was just speaking against the incentive systems. So adapting that in the practical reality is a fundamentally important point.
But to your question, Andy, actually not many companies are there yet, right? So more and more companies are getting into setting sustainability targets and even struggle with that part. When it comes to now specifically circularity targets, actually we've very rarely seen those, right? So we can pick and choose some of those that you've just mentioned, but it's still not common practice.
So, I mean, we've covered a lot there about obviously companies. This is their business models we're talking about here. But when we're talking about sustainable transformation, and circular is very much in that world, governments and regulators are also pretty important to the process. So, have you seen, or how can governments be involved in incentivizing circular practices through policy frameworks, other approaches? What kind of examples are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, so I think the regulatory conditions is a really important driver towards more circular systems. And also, obviously, for many companies, it's a force that is pushing them to put the sustainability topic on the strategic agenda. In Europe, for example, you have regulation around disclosure, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, for example, which is coming into reality really this year, where basically this is a mandatory reporting package now, very ambitious. So suddenly a lot of organizations have to build the supply chain transparency and report on E, S, and G dimensions on a very granular way. And I think that's an important and a very good situation. It's creating a lot of burden, which is not so good, and a lot of companies are really captured with the capacity and a lot of teams to deliver on that. On the other hand, it's a really important force to really push forward. I believe that when we talk about circularity and the different policy levers, it's not really only about disclosure. There are much deeper levers that become very important. Obviously, we will talk about standardization, eco-design, for example. It's an important thing to put on the regulatory agenda to provide guidance of how should products be designed to work in a more circular system. There are a lot of complex product designs which make it hard to recycle. So such standards can help to tackle that, and that is on the way, particularly in Europe. Then you will talk about bans and mandates. We see this already happening, right? So single-use plastic ban is already in place in some areas. So these are very hard regulatory measures. I believe that standards and bans and mandates, they are kind of almost like forcing devices. I believe that regulators should think more about the economic instruments, so incentivization of the right models. You can do this via fiscal measures such as tax adaptations or subsidies. So, for example, you could adjust the VAT tax scheme and make it cheaper to buy a used product, for example, or to repair a product. Economic instruments could also be public procurement, so that governmental organizations adapt their procurement policies to prefer the sustainable options. Other economic instruments are, for example, extended producer responsibility or deposit return schemes, which just help to bring more reuse into the system, for example, and to incentivize users to participate in that. These are just a few examples that I think are important to talk about when we talk about policy levers in the broad sense.
And maybe to briefly add to this, I often get asked, what is the role of the government or regulation, and why should we move if the government and regulator is not moving, right? I have a bit of a controversial opinion here. I really think, for me, the government has one role, and this is to set the economic framework conditions right. And in many ways, the right thing to do, and this is where we are far off, unfortunately, is to internalize social and environmental costs. We're getting there by saying, how do we put a price on CO2? We are far from that for many of the other natural dimensions that we're talking about, or social, not even to speak of. So I think what a business can be much, much quicker than a regulator. In business, if they see an opportunity, if they see a market opportunity as well, they will be extremely quick on jumping on this opportunity and driving circular business models. And this is why I'm thinking, yes, regulator will play a role, but if we are to wait for the regulator and then we're a multinational company and regulation differs across all countries, then I think we will wait forever. So I'm really more on the side that if we want to make this a reality, I think business are in the driver's seat. They're in a much better position to really push ahead and show that it's possible, and the regulator will follow. That's at least a little bit my observation from the past sustainability debates that we had.
Yes, I've heard it a few times now, this theory that quite a lot of the regulation that's happening at the moment is actually following on from initiatives that have already started in the markets or in business circles. So I think there's an interesting argument to be had there, and I'm trying to resist talking about it as some kind of circle, but it's very challenging. So I think one of the things that we've talked a lot, you've done a really good job of describing how companies can go about this. I think you described your book as practical, actionable, and written to deliver results, which should be a very attractive trio. So can you both also share the role, we've mentioned it very briefly, that technology and data can also play in helping businesses to adopt this, deliver those results with the business models? They're obviously a part of the picture.
And obviously, technology, in particular, AI and digital technologies, are in everybody's thinking right now. And we definitely see it as one of the absolute key enablers of a circular economy. I used to work at EPFL before, which is one of the leading tech universities. And back there, we basically said one of the reasons that we haven't advanced with circularity is that we were missing the data angle to it. And I think this is really, if we look at it, we have often treated digital and sustainability completely separate. So we have our digital transformation team, we have a sustainable transformation team, and they meet once per year on the annual Christmas party, right? So to put it very bluntly. So I think there is a case to be made to say we need to treat these two key transformations of our time as a twin transformation, right? They need to go hand in hand. There is basically a duality as well. On the one hand, it's a question, how do we make digital transformation more sustainable? But on the other hand, and this is what we've been looking at in the book quite significantly, is how can we use now digital technologies and the power of digital technologies, but also technologies at large, to help us enable and drive circular business models. And in many ways, we actually see it as a key enabler in the sense that many of the business models that we suggest would not have been possible without data, without digital technologies, without the new technologies that we're now looking at.
Yeah, I think maybe three specific applications to illustrate that. I think one is would be the whole development around digital product passports. A very interesting idea, and basically a question: why, shouldn't every product have a passport? A passport that says what's in the product, what's the material composition, and how is it used, data on the product use, how should it be treated end of life. For many products, we don't have established recycling systems that work efficiently because you don't know what's in the product. So this whole development on digital product passports is a very important topic right now, and also something which the regulator in Europe is putting onto the regulatory agenda. For batteries, for example, this will be something that will be mandated starting 2027. So to be able, for example, to really recycle that whole mountain of batteries that we're currently building up across different applications. So digital product passports is an important one. The second application is connected monitoring and maintenance. You can imagine in a world where products have a longer product life and a more productive use. In that world, you will need to be able to maintain them more efficiently, to repair them more efficiently. So this development around solutions that are able to allow for remote maintenance, for example, can really be a make or break point for the economics and to help products have a longer life. And then lastly, you said it already, it's really about advanced data analytics. And we see a lot of startups coming up with really interesting solutions to help create more efficiencies through, for example, marketplaces that build in a better data analytics system. Or one example, just as an example, which I really like, it's a startup from Berlin called Faircado. They, for example, create a plugin into the browser, which is able to crawl second-hand offers. So when you start Googling, a new product that you're considering to buy, you will search for the new product and it will pop up and tell you, well, you also get it used on these three different channels. A very innovative solution that is really building on an advanced data ecosystem, essentially.
Absolutely. That's been fascinating. Thank you. I'm especially intrigued by something pushing people in the direction of the second-hand version of goods. Be interesting to see how many people sort of pick that up and use it. So obviously we've got to wrap up at some point, no matter how interesting the discussion is. So to wrap up, could you both share your visions for what the future of sustainable business is and that role of the circular economy?
Look, in many ways, I hope that in the future we're not talking about sustainable business anymore, because there will not be businesses that are not sustainable, right? So that we have managed regulatory-wise, but also from corporate responsibility thinking, that we've really managed to say a business has to be sustainable. Otherwise, they don't have a license to operate anymore. But thinking this a step further, I really hope that we move and shift our conversation from sustainability and how can we do less harm to really regeneration. How can we as a business actually contribute positively to environment and society? So I really hope that this is the conversation we're going. And then the role of the circular economy, or more specifically circular business models, is really our concrete way to get us there and to realize and activate this vision.
Yes, and I believe that the vision should be an economy that has zero waste, optimizes resource productivity, and regenerates nature. The three principles that I've outlined at the beginning, and these are the three principles that are defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, one of the leading field builders when we talk about circularity. And my personal vision is that really we as society find a way back to really value what nature provides. It's kind of incredible the different services that nature provides. It's often called ecosystem services, whether it's the capacity of a forest to clean up the air, whether it's bees who help us to produce food. There's a lot of ecosystem services, and I believe one of the most fundamental developments should be that we find a way as society to really value these services, and with that we will solve a lot of problems that we have right now.
That sounds like a really perfect note to end on, and it's very positive as well. And so, Julia and Manuel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks to you, Andie, for the invitation.
Thank you. Ciao.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, sustainability, audit, and risk. If you're interested in learning more about circularity, I recommend listening to Season 2's Putting Circularity to Work featuring the Coca-Cola Company. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. And we'll talk again soon.